everyone. Today I'm going to demystify grafting for you and just show you what I know about grafting. It's my second year. I've taken a class and I learned some things, so I'd like you to know what those things are before you begin. First, I will talk about what is grafting. Why do we graft? Basically, we graft because we want a different variety on the root and a different variety at the top, which is the top part of the graft is called the scion wood, S-C-I-O-N, and the bottom part is the root stock. So there's more vigorous rootstock, but that vigorous rootstock produces, for example, very tiny apples or pears or whatever you're grafting. So we want the delicious pears and apples and the very vigorous rootstock. So it's essentially just combining a rootstock with a scion. And so the main idea is to have cambium to cambium contact, and there's different ways to do that. So cambium is the outer layer of a piece of wood underneath the bark, and it's usually green. Maybe it's always green, but you want the cambium layer of the rootstock to touch the cambium layer of the scion wood and to connect very well. One of the first things to do is to choose your rootstock and to choose your scion wood. So let me just show you, an example of what I'm talking about here. I'll show you a successful graft. This is a pear. So I'll show you one where I did a good job. This is an ideal graft here. So we have the rootstock on the bottom. Notice I have it labeled. And then this is part of my one of my mistakes, and I'll show you. You can see the bark is kind of messed up, and I'll tell you why in a bit. And then at the top is a different variety. So that's a 1 year's growth on an apple tree, or maybe that's a pear, actually. And basically every apple or pear that you see in the store is grafted, and many fruits. And you can, of course, graft multiple different varieties of scion onto the same rootstock. The only requirement is that you have the same species, apple or pear. You can't graft apple onto pear. Maybe you can in some cases. There are certain types of rootstock that you can't graft certain types of scion on, but that's pretty rare. So like crab apples, for example, crabapple rootstock, they won't take certain types of scion wood. So the type of grafts I'm familiar with are the whip graft, and a cleft graft, and a bark graft. So I will show you two of those, the whip graft and the cleft graft. Later in the season, I'll show you a bark graft, which is like a chip or a bud or a T-bud graft. There's many different types of graft. There's a saddle graft and a bridge grafting, but we'll go over those types of grafts in a minute. So yeah, the first thing to do is to sort of look up what type of rootstock you want, what type of scion wood you want, and the first thing that I looked at was disease resistance in the scion wood. So when I was ordering, I looked up, is the scion wood resistant to the main types of diseases. So there's basically apple scab is a main disease, fire blight, powdery mildew, and then different types of rusts like cedar rust, cedar apple rust. They're called juniper rust. So there's 4 main diseases, and different types of varieties of apples or pears are, and I'm just speaking of apples right now, but different types of apples, for example, have various levels of resistance to different types of diseases. So, for example, like one type of apple could be totally resistant to apple scab, but could be susceptible to fire blight, or moderately resistant to fire blight. And then the other thing to consider, besides disease resistance, are your zone. So what growing zone are you in? I'm in zone 5, we'll say, and so I need to find a rootstock and scion wood, but mainly rootstock that will survive the cold winters. So That was kind of a mistake. I don't know if it was a mistake, but I didn't consider that as much as I did disease resistance last year. So this year I got a few more cold hardy rootstocks, such as Dulgo. A good website to look at if you're in a temperate, cold area. I would look at a website called Walden Heights Nursery, WALDEN Heights Nursery. Tom has a very thorough explanation of the rootstocks he has tested, and he has some really nice rootstocks there. Another place to look for rootstocks is to order them is Cummins Nursery, CUMMINS. And Walden Heights has scionwood. There's, maybe look for a nursery in your area. You can go to an orchard and help prune and gather some scionwood, put it in your fridge in a bag, and wait around until it's grafting time. So that's so size of the rootstock is important to consider, because you have full-size trees, and then you have dwarf trees. Dwarf trees are nice for picking, but they need a stake. You need it to stake them in a lot of cases. So if that's something that you're not into, then you might want full size. But you have to, have a ladder for full size. Pruning is a little more difficult, and also full size trees take longer to produce. Dwarf rootstock take, just 3 to 5 years. So I got a mix of both. I'll be planting them soon. So the other thing to consider is timing. So, when do you graft? When do you get the rootstock? You have to actually cut the scionwood while the buds are still dormant. So it's kind of hard to focus on a bud, but they haven't leafed out yet. When you cut the scionwood, they shouldn't have leafed out yet. Here you can see they are actually leafing out. So we see some buds that are breaking. A little hard to focus on it there, but buds are breaking here, so that means that it is time to graft. Everybody that does grafting will teach you something different. I was taught, or have been taught recently, that you graft when the rootstocks, leaves or buds, which turn into leaves, are the size of a squirrel's ear. So you can see these are probably larger than a squirrel's ear, but some of them haven't even broken yet. Actually, the pears are still dormant in the rootstock. So, and these apple rootstocks are still dormant. So really, any time from when they break dormancy until, or even when they're still dormant, until the size of a squirrel's ear. Some of these today I'm grafting are a little bit larger. And if you order your rootstock for the first time, I'm grafting outside today because some of them are failed. They're pretty lenient. You have a cushion if you plant them outside. If the grafts don't take the first year, then you still have you can still keep them in the ground and graft the second year, which is what I'm doing today. So this is an example of a rootstock where the graft didn't take. So I'm going to let this grow out a little bit more and then graft it when it's a little bit higher. But yeah, so the timing is important. If you order your rootstock for the first time, then I would recommend basically grafting inside, and the rootstock will come wrapped in paper towels, wet paper towels, and you want to graft and then put those in the fridge. You can either put them in the fridge until after you've grafted until it's ready to plant them out, and make sure you wrap the roots not only in wet paper towels but also in a plastic bag. And you can put those in the fridge and let them, it's called healing, you can let them heal for a few weeks or a couple weeks, or you can put them in a cooler in your basement or garage, or you can just plant them out. The important thing to remember is that do not graft before it freezes. So in other words, if there's still a chance of frost, below, I would say 32, I would say anywhere below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, I would wait to graft. So this is a good time for me. I've seen a 10-day forecast. There's no frost. It is a little early, but 10 days from now is the last frost date, so I'm taking a little bit of risk. but the graft will have 10 days to heal before that possibility of frost. Before we get started on grafting, I would like to go over the mistakes that I made and the tools that you will need. So the main mistake I made, which you can probably guess by looking here, is that I ordered too many trees without knowing anything about grafting. I would recommend your first year, if you've never grafted before, don't order more than 20 trees. You can if you have somebody helping you, or if you've taken a class, or if you have some confidence, but if you have no idea how to graft, just stick to 20 trees. You will regret if you order more than 50 trees. I think I ordered something like 200 trees, which is pretty ridiculous. The second mistake I made was that, well, I don't know, some people wouldn't consider this a mistake, but I ordered the rootstock very, pretty much like a 1/4 inch thin in the diameter, and the reason is because a lot of people say that you want to match the rootstock and the size of the rootstock and the scion wood together. You want to have the same diameter, and so most scion wood that you order, you can specify what size you want, but most of it's like a 1/4 inch. Like this is a 1-year-old, so it's larger, but most of it's like a 1/4 inch. So I ordered a 1/4 inch diameter rootstock, and the issue, or it's not really an issue or a problem, but essentially the roots aren't very vigorous on a 1/4 inch rootstock, and I don't think that you actually need to match the size if you do a cleft graft for your rootstock. If you're doing a whip and tongue graft for your grafting, then you will need to match the size of the scion and rootstock. So that was I don't know if it's a big mistake, but it was. I would do it differently. I also grafted kind of low to the ground. You might have seen that. It's like, 4 or 5 inches off the ground. Well, it was 6 to 8, but what happens is that the soil builds up. I added mulch, and that turns to soil. There's going to be leaf mulch year after year, and you don't really want the graft union to be buried underground in the future. So I'm not sure how I'm going to handle that. Maybe I'll just sort of scrape back the soil at the trunk. Not 100% positive. It might be okay. Somebody told me that might be desirable, but I don't think so. You want to keep disease out of that graft union. Another mistake I made was that I got a grafting tool, which turned out to be really crappy. I don't know what brand this is, but it kind of broke because I was grafting, and essentially the idea is that you make a V cut or an omega cut. You put the branch right here, and then you close the tool, and it makes like an omega or a V cut, and you do the same with the rootstock, and you piece them together. But whenever it ended up like kind of breaking halfway through my grafts. So I would recommend actually just using a utility knife. And the last mistake I made was not fencing off the entire nursery before winter and not getting 4-foot tree tubes on the trees. So I got a lot of rabbit damage actually, because the snowpack was about 2 feet high, and so the rabbits just hopped on top of the snowpack and munched down on the delicious bark in the new growth. So fence off or get tree tubes. I'm making mine out of hardware cloth. I'll show you that later in the season. Or you can there's various types of tree tubes, and I'll send a link underneath. All right, so that leads us to tools, and I would recommend using parafilm tape. That's important. I think it's basically the best type of tape. There's lots of different types of grafting tape. You can use electrical tape. One mistake I made was using, yet another mistake, was using non-rubberized electrical tape, okay? You have to have the rubberized electrical tape. And I didn't cut it off later in the season, and so my grafts are kind of bulging in a lot of cases. This is maybe the best case scenario here, but you can see it's just not very clean because I didn't take the electrical tape off because I ordered too many trees. So you have to come back and take the electrical tape off. Maybe you don't have to for rubberized tape. You want to have a sharp knife. You can use a utility knife. That's what I'm using. That's what the guy who taught the class told me he uses. You can also use I think they're called Opinel knives. I actually have one. They're from France. That's what a lot of people use for grafting, but you don't have to have one. If you're grafting a very small cyanwood onto a large trunk rootstock, then you need a saw for a cleft graft. To saw into the rootstock, which I'll show you in a bit how to do with this utility knife, which you only need the knife if you're doing smaller rootstock. A lot of people use grafting compound. I don't. It's not, I'm not sure what it's made out of, asphalt or something weird, and I didn't use it last year. Some people don't use it, and so I opted to not get it. You can get it at a hardware store. And if you get it, use a brush. You essentially apply the grafting compound either before or underneath or over top of the grafting tape to hold in moisture. So you want to keep those rootstocks and those cyanwood very moist, essentially. You don't want them to dry out. But I'm not going to use that. And then lastly, you want to have some beeswax. Or I guess pruners. I'm using this as pruners. You want to have pruners if you want to make any cuts, which you will want to do. And then, like I said, beeswax I use. You can use different types of wax. You don't have to have beeswax, but that's for covering after you graft. There's the top part of the cyanwood. I'm going to cover that with beeswax so that it doesn't release moisture. All right, let's get started. I'm first going to show you a cleft graft. And this is the cyanwood I have sitting on a table. This is called Milo Gibson cyanwood. And I don't have my tripod, so I can't really show you. But essentially, you want to take the end of the cyanwood and you want to just cut real quickly in one swoop, one side, so that it's looks like that. And then the other side. You don't want to keep whittling away, or else what you'll have is a dip in the center. And that's not good because you won't have complete cambium contact. You can see the outside layer, the outside of the cyanwood there, the green, that's the cambium, and that's what you want to have contact with on the rootstock, which we'll see in a bit. So this looks pretty good. I have learned that the shorter, for me personally, the shorter the better on a cleft graft, because once you get long, you have to really saw down into the rootstock, and it doesn't clamp together onto the cyanwood very well, which I'll show you in a minute. Oh yes, lastly, notice that the buds are on the side here. I didn't cut through on the buds. Actually, you can see the axis. I cut through so that the buds can still be active on the... I didn't cut the buds off, so I cut on the other side. Alright, let's put this on the rootstock. Alright, here is the rootstock that I will be grafting onto. It's sprouted in a few places. I've chosen the thickest one sprout to do a cleft graft in. It's just a little bit easier. So basically, you put your knife in and you just have an even pressure. And looks like I'm going to test it out here and see if that's far enough down. It's probably maybe a little too far. And so once you make your little cleft in the rootstock, once you make a cleft in the rootstock, you want to open up, kind of open up the rootstock as you slide in. I only have one hand here. And I really want to show you this. The cambium layer of the rootstock needs to be lined up with the cambium of the cyan. Okay, I've refocused here. And as you can see, since they are different sizes, the cyanwood is quite a bit thinner, so it's only going to line up on one side of the rootstock. So it looks pretty well aligned on this side. On the other side, of course, it's not aligned at all, which is not a problem. So I'm actually going to cut this a little bit deeper, and because I still have some cambium showing up here. All right, that looks pretty darn good. You can maybe shove it down a little bit more. But, so this is what I was speaking of when I said the shorter the better for me, because, you know, once you cut deeper, the rootstock doesn't really clamp together. And notice how, you know, the rootstock's bigger, and I think if it was even a larger rootstock and you had a tiny little scion, you know, on the side, then the roots, you could go deeper, because then the rootstock would have a better chance of clamping down. But this is sort of maybe the smallest rootstock, diameter rootstock I would use for the cleft graft. All right, I'm gonna wrap it now with parafilm tape. All right, I need 2 hands for this, so there really is no right or wrong way to do this. What you want to keep in mind is that you want to make sure, you know, to keep it tight and to keep the cambium layer contact as you're wrapping it. So sometimes when you're wrapping it, you know, it can move around. I like the cleft graft because it doesn't move around as much as like a whip graft. So you want to get it tight. You actually don't want to wrap it too many times, because then it doesn't fall off on its own, and you actually want the graft to be breathable. So it actually does stick to itself, which is pretty cool. And I think, you know, the top here, you don't want any water to get in the top. So I'm gonna just make sure, you know, that I'm gonna get some more tape. It kind of stretches so that you can like stick it together to itself. But I just want to make sure the top is not going to get any water on the graft. All right, so that looks pretty good. What I was talking about is right here. I want to make sure that's pretty sealed. I probably used too much tape. Well, I'll come around later and check in the later after the graft takes or doesn't, that this has fallen off. And then, so you only want like 3 or 4, some people say 2 or 3 buds, some people say 5 or 6 buds, but you know, notice I cut off the scion wood. I cut it at an angle. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. I cut it at an angle so that water drops off, doesn't just stay stagnant. And you know, you want a few buds, because these buds are going to be the new growth. They're going to be the new growth of the apple tree. But if you have too many, then you know, there's only a small amount of cambium contact here, and so there's some water loss if you have too many buds. I actually included 4 buds here because I caught the scion wood for very, very cheap, so I can, you know, make mistakes. And you definitely want to practice, you know, what I just did here, the cutting, especially the cutting of the scion wood. Just practice with another type of, you know, wood. It doesn't have to, it can be anything in your yard, just cut it off. Practice doing the graft before you use your expensive, it can be expensive, scion wood and rootstock. Lastly, make sure to label both the rootstock and the scion wood. So this is a Geneva 935 G9. Oh wait, 935. I crossed out last year's scion, which didn't take, and put the new scion wood after the slash. Which, you know, maybe you want to have temporary labels before you put on a permanent label, just, you know, after the scion takes or not, after the graft takes or not. So you can make these out of aluminum cans, actually. You just cut up an aluminum can, which I didn't realize that, and then once you indent it with a pen or a pencil, it'll be pretty permanent. And you don't want to, one mistake, so you don't want to girdle the tree. In other words, you don't want to wrap it too tightly. You want it to be secure, but if you wrap it too tightly, then the bark will expand, and then you will girdle the tree. You will have no way to bring nutrients up, and so it will die. And I just snipped off the other sprouts here, the other, I guess, suckers on the rootstocks, where all the energy will come up to the graft here. In focus here, I'm going to show you the whip method, and it's called the whip and tongue, but I'm not putting the tongue in because it's dangerous and I'll probably go to the emergency room. because you pull a knife towards you. But basically, you can see from the side here, it's not perfect, but it's just one side of both the scion and the rootstock will connect. And I will, I have one hand here, but I'll basically, try to get as much cambium contact as I can, and then wrap it up. One thing to keep in mind is that I am not a good grafter, so that should give you some confidence. I'm still doing it. So this is like pretty decent for me. I usually keep whittling it away until it's really bad. So you can see I kind of, it's still not like a perfect ramp. It should be. See, there's like in the middle here when I line them up, there's still some room. So I'm going to press it together as best I can to get good cambium contact on both sides of the bark. And so you can see here for the whip method, you need to have like similar size scion. But if you don't have similar size scion and rootstock, then basically what you do, if they're not similar size, you can still do the whip graft. You just move the scion to one side of the rootstock so that just one side of the cambium is aligned. But these should have both sides aligned. And then one thing I forgot to mention, when you're done with this, you want to, and it's hard to see here, you want to cut off the top until you see green. It's kind of brown there. I don't know if I can refocus it. And then you want to wax the top with beeswax or another type of wax, soy wax or whatever. My newly grafted trees planted in 5-gallon buckets with holes drilled in the bottom. It's pretty economic. I mixed compost and some wood chips, composted wood chips, and some soil, pretty sandy soil. Put some wood chips on top. I just want to show you that I have a cleft graft here with small cherry scion on both sides of the cleft. So I'm going to try that. A couple different scion, actually the same type of scion, grafted onto a single rootstock to ensure that I have a graft that takes.